Well, good morning, everybody. We're going to start this Farm Office Live. Welcome you to the September Farm Office Live. And today is a special occasion. For the second consecutive year, we're coming to you for Farm Office Live from the Farm Science Review here in London, Ohio. You can see Peggy is beside me, but we do a few introductory comments as we always do for the Farm Office Live. And look at the topics that we have here. We have some federal farm program updates, crop input costs and margins outlooks. All these topics we're talking here at the Farm Science Review. Renewable energy development updates, some movement in that area. We're going to talk a little bit more of long-term care risk, and then the employee retention tax credit. Already rolling into the fall, the first official day of fall, and here we are at the Farm Science Review, and back to educational programs, back to Farm Office Live. Just to start today, if I can get my slides to move first, just for many of you across the virtual world have stood and saw Julie Strausser's work that she's done here for the farm management team for Ohio State. Really, really important lady when it came to our tax schools. And unfortunately, Julie passed away this summer from cancer, and we just send our hearts out to her family. And I know many of you online will just miss all the work that she did for us and all the behind the scenes work that many of you might not even know. Julie was responsible for making this team such a success. So our hearts go out, our prayers go out to her entire family. And I just wanted to, we're going to dedicate this session and our tax schools this year to Julie. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you the folks that you'll be seeing on today's program from left to right. You'll have Barry Ward, the director of OSU Income Tax School. Here, Peggy Hall, director of our OSU Ag and Resource Law program. Yours truly, Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Educator over in Coshocton County, David Marison. And then again, you'll have to bear with us on technology because we're not doing with the typical monitor setup that we have. Robert Moore will be here, attorney with the OSU Agriculture Resource Law program, and Jeff Lewis also. It seems like today is a lot of attorneys. You're going to hear from a lot of attorneys. Jeff Lewis, who is attorney, but also the program coordinator for the OSU Income Tax Schools, will be on as well. Just a reminder, I know that we've been working on the chat boxes disabled. I think maybe Jeff has it going to where you can click in the chat box. Jeff has given me the thumbs up from the background that if you hit the link in the background, you can get the slides for today's program. And you can also go to go.osu.edu/Farm Office Live. The Farm Office Live, of course, if you go to that website, you know that today's presentation, as it is being recorded, will be put up after we get done with the review today, as well as if we reference or talk about some of the programs from maybe last spring. Just know that all the slides and all the video recordings of all those presentations can be found on the Farm Office Live link there. Of course, as questions, you have two features in the bottom. We will try, and Jeff's working behind the scenes here at the Farm Science Review, to drop in the chat for those links that are pretty important for you. Those will be dropped in the chat box for you. If you have a question, drop those in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll be monitoring those here on site, and if we can get it in real time as the person is speaking, we will answer it. We'll be checking those Q&As. Yeah, if not, we'll be answering those behind the scenes. And as always, if you think of a question for the team after today's program and you want to send it along and you can't remember anybody's email, just remember marison.2@osu.edu. Send me that question and I'll get it to the team. And we'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can. So with that, we're going to hear a little maybe feedback, I don't know, but Peggy is here to talk about renewable energy. That's hard to say, right? You put these big words in on Thursday morning here at Farm Science Review. But we're going to talk about renewable energy. Solar has been a hot topic across the state, and we've talked about it here on the program before, but some pretty cool updates. So Peggy, we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you, David. I like your little pun there, a hot update with solar energy. Was that intentional?
It's cold.
I want to say a special good morning to Diane Shoemaker, who's out there listening, which is really odd to have Diane on the other side of our program. And we miss her here, but glad that she's still participating in some way in her new retirement life and at least joining us for the Farm Office Live. So hi, Diane, and good morning to everyone else. And thanks for joining us this morning. It's a little bit of a quiet, slow morning today at Farm Science Review. Our attendance been down a little bit this year, but a big day yesterday. And hopefully we'll start seeing some more come out and enjoy the nice cool weather that we have here today. So I want to give you a little bit of an update on what's going on across the state with renewable energy and mostly solar, as David said. That's been the primary issue, although we do have some wind energy development still taking place, not nearly at the pace that we see with our solar energy right now across the state. And we have had quite a parade of people coming through here in the Fireball building with questions about solar energy leases, solar energy projects. Had some local officials who are just shaking their heads and trying to decide what to do about solar energy development in their communities. So a lot going on in this area, David, that really has raised, I think, unexpected conflict would be a good way to phrase that, as we see in the ag community, farmers against farmers over whether solar energy is good or bad for agriculture. And I know that actually there's the Dispatch is working on a story about that. It's risen to that level where it's now getting a lot of media attention, where we have a community that is divided on this issue of whether to put these solar energy developments on farmland. And in my county, I'm from Union County, you can drive across the county and see signs up all across the county. No solar energy on prime farmland, excuse me, that's what I was trying to say. So a lot of conflict there and a lot of concern about, as we continue this pace of development, what will it do to our ag land base, to our ag communities, to rental prices, to land values? All of those questions starting to circulate now in the ag community. So one question that I'm receiving frequently here is, will this continue? Do we expect this to continue? Are we going to see a slowdown in these offers to lease land for solar energy projects? And so I wanted to give you a little information that my colleague, can you switch for me, David? My colleague, Eric Romick, who is our extension energy educator here at OSU, who just does a fantastic job looking at that development side. I look at the legal side. He's looking at the technical development side and what's happening and the trends. And he also works with installing on-farm solar energy, but he took a look at the Pjm Interconnection Cube. Now, the Pjm is our regional grid that our power producers connect into for electricity transmission. And so in order to generate electricity and feed it to the grid, you have to go through the Pjm. You have to apply, you have to submit a ton of information, and you have to be approved to ensure that your desire to connect at that place where you want to connect is safe, and that there's, that capacity can be handled there. It takes quite a while. When we first began this solar leasing activity in Ohio, it was taking about 2 years to get through the PJM, but it's now looking more 3 to 4 years. There's a backlog, and you can see that here in this slide. Eric pulled together data on what those applications look like in the PJM, and this is just for solar energy products or projects and solar storage projects. And you can see, look at that spike in 2021. Now the orange would be something that's over a project that's over 50 megawatts, and the blue is below 50 megawatts. And that number is important because the legislation that I've explained before on Farm Office Live, and that we have a lot of information on Farm Office about, Senate Bill 52, give some authority to our counties to limit or restrict development if it's over 50 megawatts. So those are the orange numbers that you see there. If it's under 50 megawatts, there is not that authority for the county to limit that development. And you can see that we saw definitely a jump from 2018 to 19 in both of those categories. A little bit of a drop off in 21, a huge jump in 2020, or from 19 to 20, a huge jump from 20 to 21. And now look at the drop to 2022, a pretty significant decrease in those projects that have to go through that PJM process in order to connect to the grid. And then as they're doing that, at some point, they would then start working with our power siting board for locating and for the state oversight of that project. So we're seeing a decrease according to this data, a decrease in those that are going through the PJM. But that brings us to another topic that I want to raise with you, and that is some legislation that's been proposed. And many of our landowners, David, who are starting to get lease offers that look a little bit different than what we've been seeing. And you can see here, David, thank you for changing the slide for me. This is where we are in Ohio. These are projects that are either operational, and we only have 2 operational solar facilities now. One is in Hardin County, and the other, where is that other one? The other green one, if you could see it on there, is at Highland County, I believe. Yes. And then you can see quite a few that are now under construction, pre-construction, and really a huge backlog still of those that are in that pending and pre-application state. But look at the distribution across what we call the Tri-C corridor. We thought it was going to go right up the corridor from Cincinnati up to Cleveland, but it's really hanging on the western side of the state. And there are reasons for that. The sun is a little bit better on the west and the best in the southwest. And then also the infrastructure plays a huge role here. But what I'm starting to hear now is a lot of interest up in that northeast part of the state. And what's driving that? And that takes us to this concept called community solar that we're starting to hear a lot about. I've had quite a few landowners through here saying they've been approached by a developer who wants to do a community solar project, and they're waiting on legislation in the state to go through. And that legislation has not gone through. It probably won't go through by the end of the year, and it will die, and it will have to be brought back if it does go through. But we've heard some pretty strong opposition from AEP to that legislation. So what I wanted to tell you a little bit about, I don't have a slide on this, David, is that legislation, and if you're hearing this term community solar, I want to tell you a little bit about what it means. A community solar project would be one that is probably not going to go through that PJM interconnection process and not going to go through our Ohio Power Siting Board. And that's because they are smaller projects. If that legislation goes through, we're looking at projects that are 10 megawatts or less, much less than the projects that you're seeing here on this map. And they can sell their energy in a certain way. They can sell it to subscribers to that energy facility. They can hook in directly to an existing distribution system. And so that's why they don't have to go through the grid. They can hook in through a substation that is already part of that grid and approved through PJM. And so what we're seeing in that, especially up in the northeast part of the state, is many of our farmers are being contacted for these smaller scale projects that are going to be 10 megawatts or less, that are 20, 30, 40 acres, is what I've been hearing people coming and saying, well, it's just a community scale solar project. So one thing I guess I want you to know about that is, first, there is no legal definition in Ohio as of this point of community scale solar. I think it sounds nice though, David. It sounds a little more palatable than solar farm or utility scale or large solar project, but they are smaller projects. And the question is, how quickly will those come into being? They can move more quickly than our larger projects because they don't have to go through the same oversight regulatory procedures that the larger projects are going through. And so if we see that legislation come next year and pass, I think we'll be seeing a lot more of those. And then also, just to let you know, we still have that backlog, as you're seeing here, of pending and pre-application projects coming. That all brings us, I think, to the closure on the question of, will we continue to see solar leasing activity in our farm communities and ag land being converted for that purpose? My answer to that would be yes, we will, but I think we are starting to see a slowdown. I think we are going to see more of these smaller acreages going into solar leases, and those projects might come up more quickly, which means that landowners would be receiving that higher rental lease payment when in production more quickly under some of those smaller scale projects that many are calling community solar. But as hopefully I've given you the message, those don't really exist yet and may not exist if some of our larger utility providers have their way and veto that legislation or stop it in its tracks. So that's my update. The other thing I should mention is just to remind everyone, we do have a lot of solar resources on farmoffice.osu.edu. So if you or someone you know is wrestling with that question of do I want to lease? What should my lease include? We have the solar leasing guide and the solar leasing checklist available there. We also, in that solar leasing guide, go through explaining the processes that a project does have to go through, and also many of the considerations that come into making that decision. And we have Robert here with me now, and Robert and I have talked a lot about what that solar lease and changing farmland to that kind of use, what that can do to a farm and to the farm business, to the it can have positive impacts. Surely it also, there are some considerations that would have to be made for that kind of a change, and certainly with the area Robert deals with estate planning and transition planning. And so we have a lot of resources to try to help families with that decision. We also have a lot of resources to help our local officials who may have to make that very difficult decision that some of them are making, to say, no, we're not going to allow large scale solar or wind development in our county. And some of them have done that. I've tracked, I think, about 6 or 7 now that are at that point where they're saying no to the larger scale development. So I'd be happy to answer any other questions. That's my quick update this morning on renewable energy. And I don't mean to focus it all on solar, but that's where most of it is coming. I should mention there is some wind development still occurring and some conflict with that. We have an issue going to the ballot up in, I believe it's in Wyandotte, no, Crawford County, I believe. The voters there will decide if they want to allow large scale wind development in their county here on the ballots. So a lot happening in that area. All right, any questions? I don't have, I don't see anything. Okay, good. So with that, I'm going to introduce Robert. He's here now, and Robert is going to talk with us this morning about some of the really good, useful work that he's doing. Is it not switching? I'm having some problems with this laptop over here. Let's see if we can get it. No, we'll have to see what. I don't think it'll work. Getting all hands on deck here. Here it goes. So Robert's going to talk with you this morning about some of the good work he's been doing in long-term care, such an important issue for many of our farmers out there. And he's going to share some strategies this morning for mitigating that risk.
All right, thanks, Peggy. Yeah, finally got the slides going here, so I'll get started on my presentation. We've talked several times in the past about long-term care and what it is and how much it costs and what the risks are. So today I'm going to talk about some of the strategies that may be available to use to mitigate those risks. And and again, before we get into mitigating risk, we need to know what the risk is. And risk depends on how much income is available, how much savings are available, how much resources or how many resources are available before the farm assets become at risk. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that today because I've covered it in the past, but keep in mind as I talk about these strategies, really before getting into the strategies, a good risk assessment is critical. And again, that's looking at the balance between what assets are available for long-term care versus how at risk are the farm assets. So the first thing we'll talk about is long-term care insurance. And in my opinion, it's the best solution to long-term care or to long-term care. You buy an insurance policy, it pays for your care, and maybe you have enough to carry or to cover long-term care costs that aren't covered by available insurance. But it's a strategy where it takes care of your long-term care payments, which keeps all of your other assets other assets safe. So that's why it's my preferred method. The problem is that it can be very expensive. It's difficult for many people to fit long-term care insurance into their budget. The other issue with long-term care insurance is not everybody is insurable. People that already have significant medical problems are not likely to be approved for a long-term care insurance. So the best time to look for long-term care insurance is probably maybe 40s, early 50s. If you're already in your 70s, being able to afford long-term care insurance may be very difficult. So again, it's my preferred strategy for long-term care, but it's something you've got to do well in advance of needing long-term care. But today's a good day to start calling your insurance agent, calling your financial advisor, see if long-term care insurance might be a good strategy for you. The next strategy is do nothing. And normally we think of do nothing strategies as, well, that's a bad strategy. And that's not always the case with long-term care costs. If someone has adequate income and or long-term care insurance and or savings in the bank, they may not need to do anything. It may be sit tight. If there are long-term care costs accrued, that there are adequate income, insurance, or savings to pay those costs. So, for somebody that can cover long-term care costs, there is no good reason to just gift away all the assets. So again, this goes back to before we figure out which strategy is best, it's that risk assessment that's so critical. And if your risk is very low for long-term care costs reaching your farm assets, the do nothing strategy may be the best strategy for you. So let's say you do your risk assessment and you are concerned that if you accrue long-term care costs, that your farm assets are at risk. What can we do? One thing you can do is to gift those assets to protect them. And this process, let's say it's land you want to protect, you sign a deed over to your children or whoever is your beneficiary. And after 5 years, those assets are safe. Now that 5-year look back period is really critical because it makes long-term care planning hard because we're always looking 5 years down the road. And what we do today, as far as gifting assets, really doesn't work until you can avoid long-term care for 5 years after that gift. So that long-term or that 5-year period is really critical to think about. So what are the advantages of gifting? It's relatively inexpensive. It's relatively easy. Sign a deed for land, sign, just a few pieces of paper to transfer livestock, machinery. So it's very easy to do, relatively inexpensive. What are the disadvantages? Well, you don't own it anymore. A gift has to be a gift. It's not, I'm going to gift you my land, but I'm going to keep all the rent. That's not a gift, at least in the sense for Medicaid. It's not a complete gift. What if you give your land to your children and one of them develops their own financial issues, get involved in a lawsuit, and now that land is at risk? So giving up that control is a big deal. And then the loss of stepped up tax basis. If you're not familiar with tax basis, someone who inherits land can turn around and sell that land for no capital gains because the tax basis of death is stepped up to the fair market value. So the stepped up tax basis is very important, very valuable to the people inheriting those assets. If you gift assets, that stepped up basis does not occur. And if they sell that same farm, there may be significant capital gains on it. So that's one thing when we're looking at gifting. It's really, should we give up that stepped up tax basis to protect the assets? And sometimes, because maybe it's low risk, we'd rather take the risk than lose that stepped up tax basis. But just keep that in mind as you factor in what strategy might be best for you. So then we get into irrevocable trust. The concept here is you set up an irrevocable trust and you name someone else as trustee. It can be a child or friend, whoever you want it to be. And then let's use land as the example. You transfer your land into the irrevocable trust, sign a deed over to the trust. And now you don't own the land anymore, the trust does. You have no control over that land. The trustee controls the land. So you still have to give up all ownership, all control, just like you did when you gifted the land. The advantage to an irrevocable trust over gifting is you can set it up and retain the income. And you would also get that stepped up tax basis. You can also include an estate planning component. Things like this farm, the Smith farm goes to this child and the Johnson farm goes to that child. The trust can have those kind of estate planning components in it. Disadvantage, can be expensive. Irrevocable trusts are kind of a complex document. So, it might be $5,000 or $10,000 to set up an irrevocable trust. Still have the 5-year look back issue. So as you transfer assets into an irrevocable trust, it's the same as a gift. It's going to be subject to the 5-year penalty period. You lose ownership and control, just like gifting. You lose stepped up basis if you do not keep the income. So whenever we set up an irrevocable trust, we talk about, should you keep the income or not? If you keep the income, it has to go to pay for your long-term care. But if you don't keep the income, you lose the stepped up tax basis. So again, this stepped up tax basis is a real big part of assessing the right strategy. And then by the nature of an irrevocable trust, it cannot be changed. So once you set up your irrevocable trust, that's the plan. We can't undo it. Self-insure. So this is where you set money aside to pay for your long-term care. Many farmers choose this option. Over the years, build up a bank account, an investment account, and say, if I go in a nursing home, this money's going to be used for that. Some people will also, designate a certain asset that can be used to pay for long-term care. So maybe they've recently bought a farm and it's, a farm that's kind of away from everything else and it's not that great of ground. They may say, well, I don't have a lot of money in the bank, but if I have to pay for long-term care, I'll just sell that farm. It's not, end of the world if I do that, and I'll use that to pay for long-term care. But the advantages are you keep full control of your assets, really no expenses required. Disadvantage is how much do you need? And the impoverished spouse issue is when you don't know how much you need, sometimes the spouse that's not in the nursing home will spend almost no money on themselves because they don't know how much they're going to need for nursing home costs. So that's one of the downsides of self-insure. Wait and see approach. This is what many farmers do, and this is hold enough assets, cash, savings, income, insurance, that you could pay for 5 years without affecting your farm assets. So maybe you have enough income, enough savings that if you go into a nursing home, you can pay for 5 years of care. So then what the strategy is, we wait and see. If somebody goes into a nursing home, then gift all the assets away then, except for the money you need to pay for 5 years of care. You get through the 5-year penalty period. Now all the assets are protected, and now you may be eligible for Medicaid, and Medicaid would pay for your long-term care thereafter. So wait and see is a very common approach, keeps flexibility, allows you to keep your assets. If you never have long-term care, you're not out anything. The disadvantage is it does not protect assets that are needed for 5 years worth of care. So the summary, no easy solutions. Long-term care planning can be difficult. It can be challenging, especially with that 5-year look back. There's just no easy solution available. What are the costs? You never know. Some people are in a nursing home for a month. Some people are in a nursing home for 10 years. It's just impossible to know what those costs are going to be. And then what resources are available. That is something you should work on. You should know how much liquidity do you have versus how much livestock, machinery, and land. And what is the true risk? Some farmers assume that if they go in the nursing home, all their land will be sold, when in fact they have enough income and savings to cover their long-term care. Which strategy may work best? As we can see, there's many different strategies. Work with your attorney, financial advisor to see what's best for you. And remember, each situation is different. Just because your parents did it one way or your neighbor did it one way doesn't mean it's the right way for you. So that's why you need to have a custom plan for yourself, and work with an attorney or financial advisor to see what's best for you. So let me see if there was any questions. Okay, what do you think about notices from long-term care to exercise benefit increase options? How do you think? Demanding. Yeah, so the question is about long-term care, and generally the insurance policies are set up that on day one, your coverage might be $150 a day. Let's say $100 a day. Then you'll get notices annually that says, okay, do you want to increase the $100 to $105 to keep up with long-term care? If you do, then your premium's going to go up this much. That's very common. So what do I think about that? If you don't keep up and you don't increase the benefit, when you need long-term care, it's going to cover less. And so I think you need to look at what's your income, what's your savings, how much does your long-term care coverage need to cover to save your farm assets. If your income and your savings is enough, don't do the increase. But if your income and savings is not enough, then you may need to do the increase. So I can't answer should you do it or not, but I think you can answer the question by assessing your own income and assets availability.
Did they ever ask us, suggest in the second part of this question that they can demand more premium to keep the same benefit? That's locked in, that original benefit rate typically in these policies. That's keeping, you keep the same. So if you have that $100 coverage, they're not going to increase the rate for that. They're only going to increase it if you want to increase your rate according to inflation.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Your premium and your coverage is locked in to start with. It's just if you want to keep up with inflation, your premiums might go up, right?
Okay.
Let's see, I've got another question. Have you heard of someone gifting farmland but retaining a subscription to the income on the property? This is a way to work around Medicare and keep all the income with mom and dad. I have not heard a subscription to income. Peggy, have you ever heard of that? So
Oh, I have not, and I have to say it raises some questions in my mind if that would be acceptable.
yeah,
To the federal government.
yeah. So I'm not familiar with that. It's similar to a life estate. You know, the parents could keep a life estate, gift the remainder interest to the children, and there's a way to make the life estate safe from nursing home cost. Yes. So it sounds like a subscription agreement is similar to that.
Yeah, and you say you have a copy of that. We would love to see that if you wouldn't mind sharing that with us.
Yeah.
We'd like to see that approach so we could more carefully analyze it.
Yeah. So yeah, can't address that too much because I don't know what it is, but maybe it's a creative way around long-term care costs. But if an attorney is recommending it and we'll sign off on it, give it a shot. Any
Okay,
other?
I think the other question was, will a life estate work for that, which you've already answered.
It will, and depending on how you set it up, it may save a portion of the land. It may save all the land. That's where you need to work with your attorney and financial planner, see how life estate work. But yeah, that's a strategy that can be used.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. And thanks for those good questions. This is a project that Robert will continue to work on, and soon we have his guide coming out on long-term care. That should be coming out very shortly. And it will be available on farmoffice.osu.edu. So keep an eye out for that. We'll let you know when it's available. All right. So next we have Barry. Barry and David are tag teaming now, so we're going to switch over.
All right, you see the quick switcheroo. And we'll stop the video. All right, we're here at the Farm Sites Review, and one of the things that we do is the Ask the Expert every day here for 20-minute rolling Ask the Expert sessions where we talk about the hottest issues that are going on in farm management as well as veterinary medicine. Well, each year, this is traditionally is where Barry Ward unveils his look at the budgets, his and his team's look at the budgets when it comes to next year. So that is what we are having Barry come on to talk about the 2023 look at budgets. Right. So I guess I want to start there, Barry. 2023 budgets, corn, soybeans, what are we looking for? Look at.
Well, we've been talking a lot about the different input costs that are going to affect growers into next year. We've got a lot of things that people have been watching and concerned about, right? You know, anything from fertilizer costs, fertilizer prices, which have gotten most of the headlines, to seed, chemical, of course, fuel and energy. And then we can also talk kind of lastly about how machinery costs and parts are going to really impact the bottom line here in the next couple of years. But first of all, starting to talk a bit about fertilizer. This is one that we've been talking about for the last couple of years. We really started to see fertilizer prices move when crop prices started to move in the fall of 2020. And we've really been in this bull market, if you will, on fertilizer costs, fairly highly correlated with crop prices. So that's something that we continue to see, and we're really not going to see much relief on fertilizer prices into 23. Nitrogen prices, you know, what we're looking at right now is still pretty strong demand. And the other thing that we're looking at pretty closely is what's going on in Europe with natural gas prices, really giving direction to nitrogen prices globally. Those shortages that they continue to experience over there have led to curtailments, or in some cases, plant shutdowns in nitrogen manufacturing. So not only do we start to see more and more natural gas flowing to Europe because of their high prices and the cutoffs that they're seeing from Russia, but also fertilizer exports going overseas to try to compensate for that hole that they're seeing in fertilizer. So fertilizer prices, I think, are going to continue to see that underpinning here in the U.S. Likely not going to be a lot of great buying opportunities through the spring, but it does depend a little bit on energy costs. You know, that's a big wild card. We don't know what's going to happen, you know, in that Eastern Europe war. If that thing were to start to decrease in its volume, and we started to see some geopolitical peace, if you will, then we might start to see energy costs, and then subsequently some fertilizer prices move lower. But overall, we're expecting to see fertilizer costs about the same as they were last year.
So about the same as last year. Now, yesterday on the Ask the Expert stage, you gave a good observation about if you're buying a large quantity of your fertilizer, something to do on the risk management side on the other side when you make that purchase.
Yeah, with a lot of the unknowns that we're seeing, we're recommending that growers, as you're making these big purchases on your fertilizer needs for next year, if you're doing it this fall or even in early winter, pair that with some of your grain sales so that you're locking in that effective margin, that fertilizer grain price margin, because that's where we see most of the volatility playing out. And you don't want to get caught in a market where fertilizer prices continue to stay high and grain prices perhaps move lower, or vice versa. You know, that vice versa would be a better scenario, obviously, but the one that you don't want to get caught in is a grain price move lower and fertilizer prices lagging to keep up.
So what are you seeing on our other inputs like seed and fuel? And then I know you're going to get into some of that fixed costs that we might need to be scratching our head about.
Well,
or maybe wringing our hands with, not scratching our head.
Yes, wringing our hands and fretting because there's not a whole lot we probably can do here in the near term. Seed costs, we're plugging in about 5% higher seed costs, and it does vary a little bit across the board depending on the genetics someone's interested in, and also depending a little bit on the size of the operation and how much leverage they may have in their buying opportunities. So about 5% higher in seed costs for the three major row crops. Chemical costs, seeing that is mostly flat. Now this may change, but we're seeing some products that look like they're going to play out in nominal increases, and some that are actually going to see decreases from last year based on just better supply chains. So that's going to be a mixed bag. Right now we're plugging, and this is a work in progress, right? This is going to look different as we go through the rest of the fall and into early winter. This is our first look and just kind of guesstimates on some of this. Now, we have started to collect some data. So those are a couple. Energy, we're actually seeing the Energy Information Administration projecting lower energy costs next year, somewhat still due to catch up in demand, because there has been some demand destruction over the last 6 to 12 months based on these higher costs. Some of that is projection for a slowing economy based on higher interest rates. So potentially a slower economy that might ease into a recession. Some economists are even predicting a more severe recession. So part of that's that. So energy costs look like they're going to be flat to lower. And then the big one that we, get into that fixed costs, and that is machinery and equipment and buying parts and repairs.
I think that's been on everybody's mind here at the Farm Science Review here this week, for sure, on all the farmers we've talked to.
And that's something that right now we're plugging in about a 20% higher fixed costs for machinery costs and parts and repairs. It's a big move, but we've even had some pushback that maybe that's not big enough. But as growers start to trade in equipment, it's going to be a substantial cost.
And he didn't stutter there, and you didn't have the background noise, but he did say 20%. 20%. So I know most of our farmers are really concerned about that side of their budgets for. Usually we don't think about that as much for repairs, equipments, and maintenance. This year, when we do our budgets, that's the number one thing that is showing up. Like, you need to pay attention to the repairs and the equipment.
That's right. Yeah. So bottom line, do we want to go there now or kind of wait until later? Do we have a question that we need?
So yeah, there's a question I'll look at, but I'm looking at that very. So bottom line, where do we look when we look at returns to land for corn, soybeans, and wheat as we're looking for next year?
Yeah, as we look at the three crops, we still have high prices and the prospects are still pretty good. And there's going to be some potential for profitability. If we look at the fall delivery of 23 corn, based on the futures prices that we have now, we can plug in about $6 a bushel corn, soybeans about $13.50, and we get into wheat, and that market has moved higher in the last couple of days, and about summer delivery $8.65. So we're still looking at some profitability prospects, even though variable costs on all three have moved higher about 10%, returns to land. So in other words, all of our costs, including fixed costs, except land. So this is what we have left over, including paying ourselves a little bit. So corn, return to land $181 per trend line yield for Ohio. Soybeans around $250 or $246, and wheat around $205. So right now, as we look at our cost structure and the relative prices of the three crops, we're looking at looking at soybeans being a little more attractive right now. That a lot can change between now and next spring.
Now, Barry, before we move off on that, and we'll come back to maybe that Q&A question, but before you go out of this subject to the next subject, where can people find these budgets? If they didn't get a chance to get out here to London, Ohio this week, where can they get these budgets, the preliminary budgets?
Right. Yeah, great question. The farm office website, that's where all of our materials are going to be available, and you can find that at farm office. .edu.
Farmoffice.osu.edu.
Yes, that's it. Thank you.
And when Jeff will get that in the link, I'm sure. Yep.
You can find our budgets, you can find our survey summaries, and of course, all of Peggy's information, Peggy and Roberts and all the ag law team, their materials that they have there, and some of the work, of course, that David does with that group, with the transition and farm transfer.
So Barry, there's a question in the Q&A, and I think we could take part of that, was mentioning about our farmers suffering researching subsidies. Are they suffering from high prices of fertilizer, and how are subsidies aiding this? So maybe, I guess, specifically, I'm going to take that and maybe move it a different direction on that question is, what government payment did you budget in for next year, if any?
Currently none. There's no, I mean, all of the COVID era legislation and all of that, those payments that were directed to producers during that period are over, including the Paycheck Protection Program. Most of the employee retention credits, of course, those are tax credits and not payments, but the traditional FSA payments, whether it be the whatever choice that they might have made in those two choices. And sometimes my mind goes blank.
With the ARC or PLC programs, those are not going to be in the money, as farmers would say, based on the formula. So those subsidies are not going to show up within the budget or the balance sheet for next year. Now, there's on the question, there's more about with poor public health, and we'll have to get a public health expert on that with regards to that question. We'll hold that question for maybe we'll grab it. I'm sure Jeff will grab that and put it into our topics for future ones where we can talk about those health. And of course, we're always worried about public health. We're, farmers are resilient when it comes to subsidies, but from what we're hearing from our experts here on the stage, are a pretty profitable year for most farm sector. And this was a year, as we look back on 2022, outside of some of the lingering rollover effects of the coronavirus pandemic money, probably a year where we didn't see a lot of government money coming into the ag sector outside of that leftover money. Is that fair to say, you think, Barry?
I think so. Yeah.
So we'll capture that question for future. Now, Barry, you also are talking on the stage about land rents. Is there anything else on the budgets that you wanted to cover? And if not, well, you did a land rent survey that I think we might want to take a peek at too.
Well, we talked about most of them. Of course, interest rates have moved higher, and so the cost of money is going to be a factor for those that are going to have to borrow money. We've got about 6% interest rate for operating money in our budgets for this next year. That's a little bit higher than perhaps the banks are charging now. But as the Fed continues to make changes, they increased their target rate 0.75% yesterday, and likely going to see upwards of another 100 basis points by the end of the year. So operating notes, operating lines of credit, other borrowing for machinery and equipment, land, all those interest rates are going to be higher as we move into 23, which will impact, we think, start to at least slow down this very hot farmland market. And that's we have been talking about the farmland market. That has been a bull market since mid 2020. And we saw, we do a survey each year, and this is some data that we collect from ag lenders, rural appraisers, professional farm managers around the state of Ohio, and get their thoughts on both land value and cash rental changes. And land values, we saw from the data that we collected, at least from 20 to 21, farmland value increasing from around 7 to close to 26.5%. That depended a little bit on the region of Ohio and the quality of that land. So a big movement there. And then another movement from 21 to 22, and somewhere between 8 and 11%. So pretty big farmland value changes. I know I'm kind of putting the farmland value ahead of our rental discussion, but I think it's it's a useful discussion to talk about there. And there were some questions over at the last session we had across the street as far as when are we going to start to see some correction in this farmland market. Don't expect it this next year. There's a lot of cash still in the system, a lot of net worth in farmers' portfolios. So that's something that we're expecting to see farmland values, even with these much higher interest rates, continue to move higher into 23. Perhaps, we think slowing down quite a bit from the last couple of years, more in the 5% range. What we're expecting for farmland values this next year. Rental rates, then, as we move on and talk about those, we've seen those increase as well. And these are a cost to farmers, additional cost to farmers as well. We saw rental rates increase from around 1.5% to 7.5% in 21, and the expectation this year is somewhere around 6 to 7% increase in cash rental rates around Ohio. So our expectation is another percentage increase into 23, probably in the range of around 5% as well. And a lot of variables to consider though, as we try to continue to evaluate that. So those are some of the numbers and data.
So summary, we're looking at some slight increases maybe on land rent or seed costs. For fuel and fertilizer staying pretty steady. Outside of that, then as far as on the income side, and I guess I should have asked it back then, those prices, the income side of those budgets for next year looks pretty similar to a year ago. Or was there a slight increase on those prices that you used, I believe, for the corn and soybeans and wheat? I don't know if you remember that offhand or not, Barry, and if that was pretty normal as where we were a year ago. So, but overall, we're probably looking a little slimmer, not a little, some slimmer margins than what we were a year ago when we had this conversation. Okay.
Slimmer margins, some of that's due to slimmer margins. We are plugging in high or lower prices actually, compared to where we were in the spring of this last year, kind of our final budgets for 22. So lower prices that we're plugging in for 23 and slightly higher input costs across the board leads us, our outlook for 22, our final budgets were pretty profitable. And even though we're still showing some potential for profitability in 23, much lower in terms of that overall profitability per acre that we're looking at for 23.
You have some big tax schools coming up. We have some tax folks online here today. Maybe now's a good time to ask you about the tax schools and kind of a reminder, like registrations are now open and you might want to jump in on those good schools that are going to be held around the state.
Yep. Very good point. Thanks, David. And you're going to be involved in some of those as well. But we have our tax schools for professionals. That registration is open. We're going to be starting here towards the end of October. We've got several in-person schools as we have had in the past. So our tax school information, I think Jeff can probably put that particular website up in the chat, and we're going to have our regular 2-day tax schools for professionals. We are also going to have our ag tax webinar in December, as we've had in the past, and we'll also have a farmer webinar, and that's going to be in November 17th. So those are some upcoming tax schools, and thanks, Jeff, for putting that up there. So you can find all of the details as far as the registration information, our schedules, and even some of the topics that we're going to be addressing in each of those webinars. So be sure to join us if you have some interest, whether you're a practitioner or if you're just a producer or landowner that don't need necessarily the 2-day school, but you want to join us for some of the other webinars. We certainly encourage you. There have been a lot of changes. We're still seeing lots of legislation that have impacted us, and we're going to follow through on some continued discussion on income averaging, among other things, knowing that farmers have had many farmers have had higher income years, and not just crop producers this time, right? Dairy farmers and others have had
Dairy's had a good year.
So just finding ways to mitigate some of those high net incomes and try to figure out ways to mitigate that tax bill. But we're also going to be talking about some Ohio legislation that has passed here in the last few months that have some tax implications as well. And we'll talk about some of those things in future Farm Office Live webinars too. So thanks, David.
Okay, I got to ask you, Barry, before we close, for your part, any other observations you have from talking to farmers this week, or questions you were asked over at the Ask the Expert stage that you want to say, hey, be thinking about this?
Well, one that came up is more of a kind of a macro type of an issue, and I don't have a good answer for everyone, is what are we faced with in terms of the possible recession? So not necessarily just a farm economy type of an issue, but an overall more global issue. The Fed is being aggressive. Most of their central banks in the world are trying to fight some inflation with slightly higher interest rates. So what does that mean for us as a global economy? I think we are probably faced with a slowdown. I think it's inevitable, and we're already seeing some signs of that. But as we try to fight inflation here, at least in the U.S., we're going to see continued higher interest rates. It's going to slow the economy. Are we going to see a soft or hard landing this next year? That's what we're going to continue to watch very, very closely and try to monitor that situation. I don't have any solid answer at this point. Many economists are agreeing on, that we're going to see some kind of recession into 23 and maybe even yet at the end of this year in this fourth quarter. I'm not convinced that we're going to see that hard landing, severe recession, in other words, in 23. But it's something that we need to continue to monitor.
Well, Barry, we appreciate you taking some time to talk about what you've been talking about here at Farm Science Review. And next, and again, if you need those budgets, want to see those budgets, farmoffice.osu.edu. The budgets, Jeff already dropped it in the chat box. So you can grab those budgets, download them on your computer, and make your changes. So with that, we're going to move into employee retention credit. A lot of been chatter and talk about that. And Jeff Lewis is going to step in, and I'm going to step aside because I'm going to have to walk over to the Ask the Expert stage to talk about family dysfunctionality. So with that, Jeff, I'm going to turn the wheels over to you for the employee retention credit.
All right, I appreciate it, David. Everyone can hear me, right? All right, so as David mentioned, the employee retention credit or retention credit is our topic of today, and it's probably the most interesting topic you will hear about on this whole program. So bear with me. The first thing I wanted to show you is this timeline of where we are with the ERC. And I specifically wanted to show you this because I wanted you to see that there are 4 major pieces of legislation within a span of about 20 months. And we start with the CARES Act, which gave us the employee retention credit. And then we go through all these different other acts and bills that came through, and they changed the employee retention credit, or they add to, or they subtract from. So when we get to where we are in the state of claiming the employee retention credit, just remember that we have a short period of time, a lot of legislation, and in between all of that legislation, we have a bunch of Treasury regulations, IRS procedures, and rules that have come out to clarify the different pieces of legislation. So tax preparers and employers, they're being bombarded with information within these 20 months. And I'm going to give a broad overview. This is just foundational to maybe try to understand where we are in terms of the processing of the employee retention credits and things that we should be looking for as employers. Very broad overview, and there's a lot of minutia and details that I could spend hours talking about for a lot of these acts and definitions. So bear with me as we go through this really quickly. The CARES Act gave us the employee retention credit, which was a 50% credit on the qualified wages paid by eligible employers. I have bolded those words, qualified wages and eligible employers, because I want you to know that not all employers are eligible and not all wages are qualified. A lot of minutia, a lot of detail that goes into there, figuring out and determining who's an eligible employer, who and what are qualified wages. But the gist of it is that an employer could possibly claim or use $10,000 worth of qualified wages for both Q3 and Q4 combined in 2020. So the max amount of the credit that an employer could claim was $5,000 per employee. Now, originally in the CARES Act, those employers that received the Paycheck Protection Program benefits could not claim the employee retention credit. But that changed in the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And that retroactively changed and allowed employers to go back to the Q3 and Q4 in 2020 and change and claim the employee retention credit. Now, the caveat with that was is that an employer cannot use the same wages to get the PPP loan benefits and the ERC. They have to be, different sets of wages, if you will. $10,000 of different wages count towards the ERC versus the PPP program. The Consolidated Appropriations Act also extended the ERC into the first 2 quarters of 2021. So now we have 4 potential quarters where an employer can claim the employee retention rate. But in 2021, the credit rose from 50% to 70%. So now an employer can claim up to $7,000 in tax credits per employee. And that allows us to get to probably $14,000. Well, then we're still not done. We in the American Rescue Plan have extended the employee retention credit another 2 quarters, 3 and 4. So now we have a total of 6 quarters where an employer can potentially claim up to 70% of qualified wages. We also inserted language into the bill that allowed for new businesses that started during the pandemic to claim ERC credits. So a lot of those new businesses cannot qualify under the traditional definition of eligible employer. So Congress inserted a new category of eligible employers that could claim this credit. It also took into consideration large employers. So when we talk about eligible employers, we talk a lot about small versus large. And originally it was 100 employees or less who were a small employer. Larger employers had more than 100. That changed in the Consolidated Appropriations Act to the number 500. 500 or less, small employer. And then with the American Rescue Plan Act, we took into consideration companies and businesses like Carnival Cruise Lines. So they were demolished by the pandemic, and they have obviously more than 500 employees. Well, they typically could not claim qualified wages for their employees. And this act allowed those employers to claim all qualified wages, regardless of time off or whatever. If they were shut down, they had a decrease of 10% or more in gross receipts. Those large employers could claim or use all qualified wages. And another important thing, we talk about where we're at today, the American Rescue Plan extended the statute of limitations for the IRS to investigate and determine fraud or excess credits granted and stuff like that. It's normally 3 years. In this plan, they increased it to 5. So then the most recent piece of legislation is the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. Now, I mentioned the amount of quarters that we could claim this ERC in. The Infrastructure and Jobs Act retroactively reduce that number. So instead of using all 4 quarters in 2021, you can only use the first 3 quarters, except for these recovery startup businesses, the businesses that started after February 15th, 2020. So just a little background on the confusion, the mix-up, and how a tech professional or an employer could get lost in the mess of employee retention credits. Now, when we claim the ERC, traditional employers will file Form 941 quarterly to claim their employee taxes, and an agricultural employer will use Form 943. To claim the ERC, you claim that on those forms. Well, if legislation came out that said, hey, you can now claim previous quarters, the ERC, you have to file an amended 941 or 943, the 941X or 943X. The employee retention credit was also allowed to be claimed in advance of the quarter. So employers could anticipate what their credit would be and ask for that refund automatically before the actual quarter taxes were filed. So this is where we get into a little bit of the issues that we're dealing with when we come to the ERC. One last final point is when an employer amends a return, they have to amend their income taxes as well. They have to reduce the deduction of employee wages. So those wages paid, take into consideration that deduction, you have to reduce that deduction because you're getting the ERC benefits and the deduction benefit. You can't have both. So that's where we are now, in a big giant mess. There's all these filings that need to be amended, all these new tax relief provisions because of the pandemic. And the important note is that the ERC is just one small piece of the pandemic relief program. You have the ARC programs, there's so many. And so all this information coming out in such a short time, all the other possible benefits and programs out there is just creating this backlog, if you will. So the Treasury Inspector General for the Tax Administration recently released a report detailing employee retention credit processing, and it wasn't great. So we're about 10 to 12 months behind on processing ERC claims. And so what that does is it leaves employers that have potentially used Form 7200 to claim the advance credit. They're getting penalties because they are supposed to pay these taxes and the ERC claim hasn't been through yet, so they don't get that reduction of that credit portion to those taxes. So there's a lot going on here. So why are we experiencing this big backlog? Well, the numerous changes that we've already talked about within those 20 years, this big piece of legislation and all the different regulations and rules coming out in between, and we just ask, was it too much too quickly? And within those pieces of legislation, we still have a problem of overgeneralization and broad terms being used in a lot of gray areas. And as an attorney who love gray areas because we can argue one way or another, but when it came to people being able to claim the credit, whether they qualified or not, it's very confusing. So with all this new information, you just keep getting lost and other answers, other questions were not answered before new legislation came out. The other problem is that with these pandemic relief programs, there was an influx of claims because everybody was suffering. And then with that, the IRS doesn't have the labor force to process all the influx of claims, not just from the ERC, but all of those different programs. The IRS is just bombarded. So we sit here at a 10 to 12 month backlog from processing these claims. So we have a distracted IRS. And because of the numerous changes in the short amount of time and unclear regulations, it leaves ripe for fraud. And that's where I wanted to make sure that employers are aware of these, I'm going to call them ERC mills. So there is a growing trend of these specialty tax consulting companies, and they're holding themselves out to be employee retention credit experts. And typically these employee retention credit experts will sign client engagement letters charging a fixed percentage of the full amount of the credit received by their client. This incentivizes those companies to try to just, shotgun approach it and claim as much of the employee retention credit as they can, regardless of whether or not their client actually qualifies for the employee retention credit in that quarter. So how's this going to affect employers? There's going to be audits by the IRS. In May, the IRS came out with a news release saying they're going to ramp up the auditing of the employee retention credit. And because of the 5-year statute of limitations, it even gives the IRS that much more leeway to investigate and enforce the tax laws. So the penalties for an employer could be for the unpaid employment taxes, and the employer is going to be responsible. So there is a removal penalty under the CARES Act, and it goes through a reasonable anticipation standard of the Department of Treasury. And it can be easily, the penalty can be easily removed, but it's still a litigation hassle. It's still a headache for an employer. And just a little law 101, ignorance of the law is no defense at all. I should say no defense at all. Just because you have someone else filling out the employee retention credits for you, these ERC mills, in a couple of years, they're probably not going to be around. And you as the employer are still going to be held liable for that unjust enrichment. You got so much of the employee retention credit that you shouldn't have, and they're not just going to let you keep it because somebody else did something wrong. Again, it's going to be a big headache and involve a lot of lawyers and a lot more money to defend yourself. So what can an employer do to avoid fraud? The first suggestion is to research the company that is suggesting to you that they are a employee retention credit expert. When was the company founded? If it was founded in the middle of 2020, 2021, maybe a red flag, because it seems like they're trying to take advantage of those credits and the distraction of our federal government with all these claims coming in. Then research the founders of the company. Do they have actual tax experience? Are they, I think an example given was that somebody was a marketing expert and not a tax expert. So they were business to business marketing, no tax experience, but they were an ERC expert. And then check into the company's reality. Sometimes the company's website looks really good, and then when you look up their address on Google Maps, it's a strip mall location. So for example, ERC specialist could have a high-rise building on their website, and then when you go to look at that address, you see it in the strip mall next to your Kroger's. The next thing, and then probably the most important thing, is to document everything. And this includes even with your trusted attorney or CPA or other tax preparer. You want to document the employee wages, the amount paid, any governmental orders. So here in Ohio, Governor DeWine sent out executive orders. And that demonstrates the partial shutdowns or complete shutdowns of your operation, depending on what kind of employer you are. Save all your gross receipts for 5 years, maybe even a few years before the pandemic. Get all those together and save those in case you have to prove your gross receipts and then decline in those. Save your PPP documents. If you got the PPP loan repaid and you took the ERC thing, make sure you have those documents separated, showing specifically that these wages used for the ERC credit were not used to calculate the PPP loan. Save all the tax forms, and like I said, make sure you maintain those documents at least another 5 years after you filed the taxes for that specific quarter. Third thing you could do is make sure you seek out a licensed professional. An attorney or CPA are less likely to risk their whole career to fraudulently get these ERC claims through on your behalf. And last but not least, make sure you trust your gut. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is, and you should avoid that at all costs. And with that, like I said, very broad overview of the employee retention credit. And that's all I have, unless you have any questions. Not seeing any. Barry, you go and say salutation? No. And so thank you guys for joining. We're coming back next October 21st, join us at 10 a.m. and hope to see you there.
All right. Thanks, folks. Thanks for joining us. See ya.